I'm really pleased to introduce Marty. She is a treasured long-term colleague of many of us, and we're really happy to have her here again for what has proven to be a very informative and popular lecture over the last however many decades we've been doing this. She has over 50 years of experience as a social worker, a gerontologist, and an educator. She is now retired. She was an affiliate assistant professor at the UW through the School of Social Work and the Institute on Aging, and she's been in private practice of social work. She currently sits on the Washington State Dementia Action Collaborative, and she's the author of a book on care sharing focused on caregiving and care receiving in the complexities of aging, illness, or disability. And we're so pleased to have Marty to come talk with us again on grief and loss. Welcome.
Thank you, Barbara. I'm really glad to be here. And I am sitting here in sunny Port Townsend, Washington, which some of you may know is a rural area outside of Seattle, to talk about a topic that's really tough for me to talk about today, and I think maybe for some of you, excuse me, and that is the topic of loss and grief. We also know that this has been a year for all of us with COVID-19 and other issues, that grief and loss has touched us personally, as well as the people that we care for in our work. I would ask you today, as we go through this topic, that you think about the losses and grief that you faced, because I think it's important for us to be aware of that as we encounter older and disabled adults who have been dealing with the grief of COVID and other grief as well. I just got back the other day from going to 3 Zoom funerals this year. One was in New Jersey last Saturday morning. The good thing was I was able to go and probably wouldn't have been able to fly back. The bad thing was the people who were the connections that right next door to my friend weren't able to be there, only the immediate family. And I think that just sort of speaks to me about what grief and loss means for all of us. So I'd encourage you as we go along to think about how grief and loss has affected you. Our goals today are to explore loss and grief and examine COVID-19's effect on them. Consider the ways that grief and loss impact what really matters, what I refer to and will be referring to as meaning, and to explore dementia's effects on loss and grief in persons and carers. Don't forget also that we're still in a time of upheaval. I got a Facebook posting today from someone whose sister had just died, who's about my age, of COVID in the last week. So we're not out of the woods yet, for sure. We know that grief is a normal and a painful process. It isn't one and done, it goes on, and I'll be talking more about that. We know that each person deals with losses and grief in their own way. And I think sometimes in my lifetime, and maybe some of you in your healthcare roles over time, have wanted to share, oh, I know what you're feeling, I've been through that, or I know what it's like. We don't know what it's like for anybody but ourselves. And it's important to remember that there's no timelines for grief. As someone said, it takes as long as it takes. Processing loss and grief can be difficult. There are varied emotions, often influenced by culture and the value systems. Remember this, that we deal with so many cultures and groups of people who have been raised differently than us. We need to sort of explore what it is that they're thinking about or experiencing. Now, I know sometimes you have limited time, but as much as you can, think about that. I just got back from ASA last week by Zoom, of course, the American Society on Aging. And there were lots of sessions about disparity in healthcare and the issues for many different cultural groups. And one of the groups that I was especially important for me to listen to think about the refugees and the immigrants who have come to our country, who often don't have the language, who often have been traumatized by experience of loss and grief coming to this culture, and what they are now facing with COVID and other kinds of issues related to losses as well. And remember that those around persons are grieving, as well as the person who may be facing the loss or has just lost someone, and they feel losses as well. Oftentimes, I find that these people are not necessarily taken into account as we begin to deal with loss and grief in a family. Grieving is not linear, but cyclical. And remember that resolution may not always be possible. Isolation and loneliness are closely involved with loss and grief. And I know you had a wonderful session on isolation a few weeks ago. And again, at the American Society on Aging, we had several sessions about loneliness and its costs on our medical system and mental health system and the individual elders and people who have been alone and lonely during this time. Events around a person in cares influence how loss and grief are experienced. I don't know about you, but in this past year, all of the news about gun violence and racial disparities and presidential elections and COVID and all of these things have been just laying down us like this. Don't underestimate the power that they have to influence how people may be struggling with their own loss and grief. Now, well, acknowledging and naming losses and grief are beneficial. Sometimes just saying, you're grieving is important. Recently, I worked with a family, mother who had a daughter who was pushing her not to, quote, move her husband with Parkinson's to an adult family home. The daughter was saying, Mom, you need to keep on caring for him. And this gentleman with Parkinson's had lost a lot of ability to move, to be independent, and the wife could no longer care for him. And what was hard in working with her and her daughter was to help them acknowledge that they were facing losses and grief already. And he just died a month ago. And I think they're doing better now. But before that, the daughter just couldn't understand why she just couldn't keep her father and this woman's husband at home. The other thing that happens is current losses may expose past losses and grief, especially unresolved grief. I'm going to talk more about that. What happens, though, with people not dealing with difficult losses, it can lead to complicated grief in the future. So I want to point out, and I think this is really important, is that some losses are big, some little, some are obvious, some subtle. For example, losing a partner, that's big. Losing a dinner companion may seem little, but may mean a lot to a family member who has lost their loved one. Some more subtle losses are the losses of connection to other people related to, I'm in a widower role now, or I'm in a disabled role now, so I'm not treated the same. And I'm going to talk a little bit about dementia in a bit. And there's a lot of losses related to having dementia. Individual loss and grief can be worse within the COVID-19 context, and we all know that. I think one example that I have is of a Texas carer who was writing at a conference that being locked out of her mom's nursing home was really, really tough. Not to be able to touch, they would share through the window, that was hard. Another spouse of somebody early in the COVID time, I think we've opened some doors since that time. Her husband was in the hospital. She had to give the DNR order from the phone, but could not be with him. And part of the reason she could not be with him is the rules of the hospital, and that she knew that she had other disabled family members at home, that she couldn't risk getting COVID to go into the hospital to see him at the end. So I think there are these kind of situations which COVID has made very, very difficult. Persons with dementia do feel loss and grief, but often don't have the words to express those feelings. And not only people with dementia, but developmentally disabled people and other people who have not being seen by people as having those feelings or those emotions to share, they feel the grief as well. I really get angry and frustrated when somebody loses a beloved pet who is their whole life, and their neighbor or their friend says, well, just get a new pet, it'll be all right. It's hard. And as I said earlier, we're feeling that loss and grief as well. That's going on all around us. And countertransference can be a real concern for us in healthcare. By what I mean by that, some of you may remember Bonnie Genevieve, who was a social worker in Seattle for a long, long time. He wrote about loss and grief, and she used the term countertransference to talk about what happens in the personal and professional connections when we work in healthcare, when we work in the community. And by this, if we're dealing with loss and grief in our own life for whatever reason, and can't acknowledge it, can't talk about it, we may still be bringing that to our work with the person that we see in the hospital or the nursing home or the community. And it's not bad or good. I think some of us have been told, and in COVID, it's been true, that you move on from one person, it's on to the next, and it's on to the next. To some extent, it's always been like that, but certainly COVID-19 has made that much worse. So what are those things inside you that you've been dealing with, again, that can make a wall in front of you in dealing with the person that you're caring for in your particular healthcare situation? Now, some losses that we've seen this year and in other times as well, but the loss of normal in their lives. So if I have a diagnosis that says I have a few months to live and hospice is in there helping, and I can't do the things I used to do, what is normal? And that's can happen when I can't get around very well because I've had an amputation of my leg or a lot of different reasons. With COVID-19, the lack of connection to a support network has been a real challenge, and getting around that through media and the technology that we have is a big challenge. So there are challenges and connections to carers, family, and friends. And many of us have had that as well. My daughter is coming in 2 weeks to see me. I've not seen her for a year and a half. She's finally fully vaccinated and I am. And I really realize how much that lack of connection, even though we talk every single day, is for me, a quote unquote, healthy older adult. Probably one of the hardest things is the lack of rituals to deal with loss and grief. And again, not being able to have the funeral, not being able to have a ritual. I think part of that, we may need to develop new rituals with an individual to help them to get through some things. There are certainly different roles where people have had to take on the role of caregiver that they've never done before, or the person who always paid the bills is now having to defer that to another partner or a child or someone else who's taking that role. There are changes in structured and unstructured time. And it's important to remember as we do this work that carers and individuals may process differently at different times. So I may be, as a person who's dying of cancer, ready to say, okay, it's time. And my daughter, who's sitting there with me, says, no, you can't die, you can't die. When my aunt was dying many years ago at 102 and a half, her sister was also in the same nursing home. And as she was dying, and I was trying to help her out of that process by saying we'd take care of Charlotte and we'd do what we needed to do, Charlotte kept saying at the same time, don't die on me, Tony, don't die on me, Tony. Well, that's hard to hear. And I think people may not say it, but they're doing some things to give that message across. I think that another thing that often happens is the loss of home when people have to move to long-term care or to memory care or something like that. In fact, moving to care away from home has often been described as homelessness. And when we think about that and the implications of that, it's pretty strong. But the loss of home, and then you add all these other things on, is very, very difficult. The loss of a sense of meaning and purpose. If I'm dying, I'm facing my loss, I'm not just a dying patient or a dying person. I'm also losing some of those roles that I played, like daughter, son, husband, wife, grandpa, community member, and other losses that can happen as a result of the loss of an identified one. One of the biggest ones right now we're looking at is loss of income and how people are just barely getting by. I think it's really important that that issue, along with a lack of independence and increased dependence, and with that comes loss of decision-making, these losses are quite great. And somebody was telling me about somebody that she had encountered recently who was very, very frail. And she got to know this person and realized this frail person had actually been a lawyer in the small community where she lived. And she said, so I'm in a whole new world, a whole new light. But that guy knew that he'd lost his role in the community as well. Now, I think not only the person going through the loss and struggling with the grief about the loss is also there with the care. And I use the word carer, by the way, instead of caregiver. I like that it's a more even, people are on the same level in their relationship. So caregivers' loss include remembered shared history, changed hopes and dreams. Many years ago, I met a couple where they had saved for retirement. They had bought an RV. They were going to go RVing across the country. And just before he retired, he was diagnosed with terminal cancer. And he said, look out there, there's the RV we bought. And it just reminds me every day of our loss and loss of dreams and our loss of plans for the future. There is an altered sense of meaning and purpose, and sometimes a loss of relationship and companionship. What is it like to have switched over into the role of carer when you've always been friend, partner, lover, and now your role is making sure somebody is being cared for 24 hours a day. There was a wonderful session that I heard at ASA from Rush University Medical Center in Chicago, and they also use the 4Ms and the age-friendly approach to caring. And by the way, I'm really glad to be able to live under that model. I was introduced to it about a year ago, and it really makes sense to look at whole person care. And they did a session saying caregivers as providers should be changed to caregivers as people. So they write their care plan for people, not just about grief and loss, but everything else, taking that primary care into consideration as they write the care plan that everybody on the care team looks at. And then when they send somebody home, they also follow with that team. Now they have a grant from Retirement Research Foundation, which is called RFF Foundation now, and some other money. But they say, why would you send somebody home who has never ever done nursing care and say, take care of this person's ostomy bag? And some beginning nurses wouldn't even pick up to want to do that right away. And we send them home with little care, a little understanding, a little follow-up to make sure. But I think that that kind of a thinking about taking those carers into account as somebody is dealing with loss and grief in the hospital setting, the nursing home setting, whatever, really makes sense. But, you know, it hasn't always really happened as well as it should. Carers and friends, the person is taking too long in their grief. You know, if I feel like grief should last a certain amount of time, I may say to my mom, well, get on with it, or my dad, or my friend. Well, it's true that people need the time that they need. It takes as long as it takes. That's the reality, and we need to allow that to happen. Carers also may feel an anniversary reaction after loss. Easter time is difficult for me because I lost my father many years ago around Easter time. And then my mother-in-law and my brother died in the same week at Easter time. And even though that's a movable holiday, you know, the lilies are out, spring is springing in most parts of the country. And so don't underestimate the power of an anniversary loss. And just because somebody has dementia or seems not to understand, there may be some remnants of that there. I think I want to talk now a little bit about grief overload and what that means. And this is the adverse effects of many losses building over time. Many of the stuff that things that I was talking about, the stuff that people have had to deal with, just builds up over time. And I'm now 7.
Can I pose a question that came in
Sure.
real quick? And that is wondering, you had mentioned a grief and loss book by Bonnie, and I don't know the spelling of the name. Do you have that information?
Okay, Bonnie Genevay, Genevay, wrote a book about countertransference. It's bigger than grief and loss. It's probably out of print, but she was a social worker here in Seattle area for many, many, many years.
All right, thank you.
Sorry, I can't give you more than that. It's a sense of too muchness that many people have. There's just too many losses going on. Some days I don't even want to answer my phone or look at my email because I've lost so many friends in the last year, some to COVID and some for other reasons that had nothing to do with COVID. But at my age, and with many chronic illnesses that people have over at my age, this is going to happen more and more. But for the caregiver or the person who is going through the loss themselves, they also have these things going on. It's a sense of too muchness. and a compounding of losses happening to persons and carers both. And I think we just need to keep this in mind, that many people come to you to get care for whatever reason, already having all of these kinds of levels of grief and loss to deal with. Now, this one I see a lot in people who are dealing with a cancer diagnosis, and or a person who has dementia, or some other illness that they can see the handwritings on the wall. You know, people start grieving for coming losses, and it occurs incrementally for the person and the carers, and it needs naming also. But the worst of it is, it does put people in limbo. I've heard comments from friends of people saying, he's not even dead yet, and she's acting like he's gone already, to somebody who has gone out and done something while their person was being cared for by others. Or the nurse, who was a nurse I worked with for years when I worked in long-term care, talked about her mother. And she said, I grieved for my mother when her dementia was so bad she didn't recognize me. And then she said, but I was really surprised when she died, I grieved so much. And then I realized I was grieving for the person that she had become. The little old lady, the frail little old lady that she'd become. And that always stuck with me, about we can grieve more than once over the same situation. And then there's this whole area of disenfranchised. I wish I could see you all and you could nod your head if you're familiar with this term. But I think there's a lot of disenfranchised grief in our world that doesn't get expressed. And people live with that, and then you just add it to whatever's happening now, whether it's COVID or some other illness. It's grief that cannot be expressed. It can be grief from past trauma. It's grief that others may discount. Like I said, the death of a pet is a really good one, because why would you grieve over your pet? And yet I know a lot of people who grieve over their pet. And suppressed grief arising in the current situation is there. Let's talk about what some of these are. And these are examples of some people that I've known over time, and they were elderly and they were still dealing with this, as well as dealing with ill health. One of them is the death of a child that's never been talked about, or stillborn child, really difficult. Miscarriage. Often we didn't have groups in the old days to help people, or having an abortion. It's a thing that really wasn't talked about. Now it's a big political issue, but there are people who've had them, and in their older years, as they're looking back, talk about this in their life. And then with all the DNA and people finding people, we have all of this issue of having a baby out of wedlock, feeling the loss, having them being adopted, and on and on and on. Unexpected death. That's a really hard one for people, where just out of the blue, somebody drops dead. And okay, if they're young, you maybe have the rituals and the ceremonies, and then you get on with your life. And that can be difficult as well. Some of the ones I've been aware of more recently, I mean, things like battlefield death and having to move forward in battle, or having a missing body of family or friend. There have been some families dealing with murder victims that have never been found. I've had some recently in Seattle where a body's been found of somebody who was murdered many years ago, or missing in action, folks. That's difficult. And then the loss of someone or a situation that's a family secret. And it's been, I would say, not very long that we've really looked at this as being a problem where you're involved with a partner that you can't share with your family for whatever political or other reason. You might lose your job. In the old days, you might lose your job if you were gay or lesbian and lived with somebody and you didn't get your 3 days of even bereavement leave because you might lose your job if they found out you were in that kind of relationship. All kinds of family secrets that can happen. Post-COVID, this may be present with the opening of a new normal. What are the losses that didn't get dealt with? Not having permission or being able to grieve at the time of loss may resurface it, and grief may get frozen in time. And we have people now that are dealing with about whatever's going on in the present day, who are also dealing with many of these things as well. Then there's all of the work, and this book is on your bibliography that talks about ambiguous loss and the grief that comes with that. Pauline Boss is the author. You can look it up on the last slides. And this is a loss where there's no closure. There may not be an opportunity for resolution, and the unresolved grief just keeps people moving on. Big issue for people who have dementia. There can be a physical presence without mental ability. So people are in this, I'm neither wife nor widow, I don't know who I am, I don't know what's going to happen. These kinds of things can be really difficult. And people do keep looking for answers. And there's a lot of grief being in that kind of a relationship. Grief gets put on hold, and what people have described is a roller coaster of losing and finding over and over and over again. And I see this too with people who are at maybe the point of death, and they have a good day. Often I see this the day or two before they die, and their carers, their partners, their kids are saying, oh, well, maybe they're doing that better. Maybe there's a miraculous thing that's happening and they're going to get better, and they don't. It also has been described as emotional quicksand. And the challenge in this is balancing the present reality in the face of the future. How do you know? You know, some people have been given 6 months to live and they live a year. I just read a story about a young couple today that married because he was given a very short amount of time to live, 6 months, and he ended up living 11. Well, they married because they knew he was dying. They were like in their 20s, and they were thankful for the days that they have. But at the same time, they always knew that that was out there, always knew that that was out there. Uncertainties are difficult for any of us. So they need to be recognized. Sometimes we have to name them with people and reflected upon. It requires paradoxical thinking, or both and. So if I say my partner has dementia and we're going to spend every day that we can sharing in whatever way was normal for us, but I know he's changing and I can help with that change. It's paradoxical. Unanswered questions are discomforting. And there's a lot about loss and grief. Why God? Why me? Why now? Why not somebody else? Why my son? Why not me? All of those kinds of questions. And they're very discomforting to the person, but they're very, very discomforting to the people around them as well. Now, some examples of ambiguous loss, neither wife nor widow, that I mentioned in dementia. The pain and breaking up of relationships, divorce, whatever. There's a lot of pain in not knowing where it's going to go, what's going to happen. And then, as I mentioned earlier, refugees or immigrants in transition. for a while, many years ago, I worked with some refugees from Eastern Europe who had a lot of trauma history related to watching their fathers die because they were political dissidents. And that stayed with them as they dealt with coming to this country, as they dealt with illness in their family, as they dealt with aging and other kinds of things. And it was very, very hard times for them. So let's talk about people with dementia and their cares and how they face loss and grief. I have just been reading a wonderful book, which is not on your bibliography, and it's called No Vanishing. And it's by a woman named Lynn Castile Harper. And that last name is Harper, and the first name is Lynn, Lynn. Castile, Casteel. And she talks about how we vanish people with dementia in our society as if they don't exist, as if they don't feel, as if they don't have loss and grief. She is a person who worked as a chaplain with people with dementia, and she's now a pastor in a church in at the Riverside Church in New York, huge church. Anyway, it is a very interesting study about, and some research she's done about what it means as we as a society vanish people with dementia. And I would suggest that if you're interested in that whole concept, that's an excellent book to read. It's a brand new book in the last year. But the idea that families or healthcare providers or others don't believe that people with dementia are facing that loss and grief is a result of our vanishing them in our society, and they don't exist. She was even told by a fellow chaplain, or not a chaplain, it was a pastor who was working with the chaplain, said, well, I guess you won't be going to see them because they're not there. And that's the kind of stuff our society does. In my work with the Dementia Action Collaborative, we're working on, what is it people can do? And we encounter them in the hospital and they're just don't seem to get it. And we think there's nothing there. Well, if we talk about meaning and loss and grief for these people, we may have to look at this in a different way because it does affect them. And suffering is a part of this. People, they have a sense of suffering, and it can affect how they deal with losses and move into their grief. Again, cultural and spiritual beliefs affect how suffering is dealt with. And years ago, when I worked in long-term care, which has been many now, we used to have, when we wrote patient care plans or resident care plans, a thing called spiritual distress. And I think that this is a place where use of that as a meaning, what matters kind of a question, is an important way of describing it. It is the crying. I think some of the even crying out, help me, help me, help me, help me, is almost an existential cry about, am I still here? So I really want to stress that the carer is grieving, but that person is grieving as well. And sometimes when we're able to sit and hold hands with people and talk, they need to just be with someone. Maybe they need the chaplain, maybe they need their husband or wife or partner of long-term to be with them. We accompany people through suffering, but can't take it away. It's difficult to watch a person suffer through a loss and resultant grief. So we have to be patient and they have to be patient. So I want to take a few minutes here to have you write down on a piece of paper your own loss and grief issues, and then to see how they've been affecting your practice. What are the things that you've been grieving this year as a result of a death, as a result of loss of connection in relationships, through loss of relationships with somebody who has dementia or other mental changes. And then how did they affect your practice? Because I think that's where the rubber hits the road. So I'm just going to give you a minute in your own places to take a moment and write down some of those things for yourself. Okay, you probably could take hours, but I want you to think about that as we move along and how we begin to deal with grief and loss with people, how we begin to help them through it, how we look at our own stuff. I will share one example of what happened to me many, many years ago. My father-in-law was dying of cancer, and I was working in a skilled care facility as a social worker in the acute care unit and of our nursing home, where we got the Medicare patients who were going home and a few who were there to die. And this particular gentleman I was asked to see, a new resident, walked in the door, and I saw my father-in-law. He looked like my father-in-law. His diagnosis was similar to my father-in-law's. His background in this small area where I lived was the same. And I said to myself, I have so much going on inside of me, I can't work with this man. And I couldn't. And luckily I had another social worker who could take over. But I recognized walking in the door that my grief and loss was not going to be helpful. Now I realize that sometimes we have to get beyond that and move on and take care of the person anyway, but we have to get rid of that somewhere and deal with it, because it's going to happen to all of us in one way or another, and you may have some examples. And if we were together, we could share some of those, but if you want to put them in the chat, that's great. One of the things that I have found as a helpful model in dealing with the meaning issues, spiritual issues, the what matter issues, involves the use of the hope model. And I don't know if any of you have used this. My slide here is adapted from a woman named Christine Polchowski, who was a doctor, is a doctor in the Midwest. It's the first time I heard of this model. And she uses really 4 very simple things to think about, which aren't simple at all, but the idea of thinking of hope in this way is important. H stands for sources of hope, meaning, comfort, strengths, love, and connection. What are those for this person? We need to know that as they face the end of their life, or they face grief, or they face living without somebody. O is for organized faith-based group. P is for personal spirituality and practices. And then E is, how does this affect medical care or end of life issues for them? Now let's unpack this a little bit. I think the first one, sources of hope, meaning, comfort, strength, love, and connection, is really important. I've known people, and hospice has a wonderful saying, hope changes for people, actual hope, which is not just a belief in an afterlife, but for some people it is. It's also how I get through the day. So many people tell me that they get through comforted by prayer or by knowing that somebody loves me out there. But I think we need to be aware of that, and that hope does change. So I may have cancer diagnosis today, and I say, well, I want to live long enough so I can see my grandson graduate from middle school. And maybe then my cancer gets worse, and I decide, well, I'm maybe not going to be able to do that. But maybe I can live long enough to see him one more time. And then as my cancer gets worse, I may say, well, I want to have people around me as I die. And I want, a lot of things written down, wishes, etc., that people can do. And then third, I might say, I don't want to be alone, or I do want to be alone. But that's how hope can change over time. The organized faith-based group is a little trickier because in the West, we are a lot of nuns, NONES, and don't identify with any tradition. But if we do and would like to have that person near us in normal times, we can. We need to know who that person is. Personal spirituality and practices is much more important. And that's probably most of the people that I worked with in the Northwest that I have seen them speak to that. Again, what matters to them. And it may be that I have time to meditate. It may be that I need my healer to come. It may be that I need some kind of place that's quiet, that people aren't waking me up 5 or 6 times a day, that I can actually have my meditation time. Or it might be that I don't eat certain foods, or that I do certain practices, or I need to be covered in a certain way. But we need to know that from people, and it helps us then to help them as they go through their process of life. And obviously then the effects on medical care, end of life. And I remember really very clearly many years ago working with a disabled woman who was in her early 60s, who was in a Medicare unit. And she said to me, I can't pray during the day because my roommate turns on her light and it shines in my eyes and it keeps me from praying. So I thought, now what do we do about this? So I didn't believe her because I didn't think the light shone through. But then I actually got down on her bed and looked up, and it did. So we moved the bed just a little bit to be out of the line of sight of the light. And when we did, this woman could pray in the morning, her roommate could get up, and there was no problem. Now, sometimes we get down to the nitty-gritty of that kind of thing, but it made such a difference in her life that she could do her personal spirituality practice, which for her was praying. So let's look at loss and grief. The first one is acknowledge the loss and grief. This is absolutely baseline. And give people permission to acknowledge the loss and grief. A lot of people can't acknowledge what they're feeling is related to loss and grief. And we all know about fear, anger, sadness that happen, but we oftentimes deal with people who don't put those all together, and we may have to do some connecting for them. If it's possible, give the person the time they need for the grief work. Unfortunately, in healthcare these days, it's move, 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 move. And so it's difficult. Maybe we can, as we talk about including the carers and the people who are the support network, we need to help them have the tools to be able to do this as well. We don't have to do it all the time. You have to listen, listen, and listen, and practice compassionate presence. That means being there without judgment, trying to be as there, totally there as we can be for that moment. And I've heard amazing stories during COVID when people were dying, where the nurse or the people working with somebody held up a phone so they could be with their loved one, or would pray with them at the end of their life, or whatever. I know it's tough, I know it's hard, but as much as we can to engage people, even using the technology of an iPhone or some other kind of way of connecting. But that family needs to know how important it is, or that connected person, or that friend, or that clergy person, or whoever. As possible, remember that people are on a journey. We may see them for a short period of time, but they've been on a journey with their illness, with their disabilities, with whatever, even COVID over time. Maybe a short time, but it is a journey, from people who are totally well today, who come down sick and who are died 3 days later. We're on a journey as well with them. And I think that part sometimes gets lost. It's not one and done, it goes on. I mentioned emphasizing the normalcy of anger and guilt and all of that. Support through pain. Don't protect people from pain. And by this, I mean mentally and physically. And obviously, you can help people with medication to help them so they're not totally in pain. But I think it's important that somebody very wise said to me, don't take away the tissue too soon. Let people express that pain, that emotional stuff that comes from now or from other stuff that's there. And notice how loss and grief are affecting a person's general health. I have been to see my physician and my cardiologist in this COVID year, and talking about the overwhelmingness of all this stuff on my shoulders. And both of them said to me, you would be amazed at how many people come into our office and they have other illness issues, but this whole year, this whole time of not being with people, this whole thing of feeling not being very worthwhile because their life has changed so much. And as family practice docs and as this cardiologists were saying, this is something we see very, very commonly. Now, I'm a person who's in a relationship with somebody I like in a place where I'm not that restricted on 5 acres of land, but it still got to me. And I was talking about that, and they said, we understand because everybody in our office is talking about that. So people coming into the hospital, to whatever place that you do your practice, are feeling this on top of everything else. Medication can help people through emotional pain, but it's not the only way that people are assisted. So we have to understand how culture, history, and values affect loss and grieving for persons. And we need to accommodate needs for rituals as possible. And this is a hard one too in an age of COVID, where we can't necessarily have people in washing a body right there in a ritual way that they might do, or other kinds of things that they might do given their tradition. One of the things that I found for myself and for many of my elder friends and for people I've worked with over the years is that older adults, disabled adults, people going through loss and grief issues have resilience, which means bouncing, according to the American Psychological Association, bouncing back from setbacks, returning to a sense of balance in some way. And that one's a tough one. What is balance? It's new balance. I'm not going to get up in the morning and see my husband, who's made me a cup of coffee and laid out breakfast for me. I'm going to have to figure out a way of having breakfast on my own, remembering his presence, but knowing that this is the new balance. Resilience becomes a buffering factor in challenges. Why do some people operate one way and some people operate the other way in a situation that's very similar? Often it's because they do have this sense of resilience. Having a future purpose and getting stronger in challenges. Sometimes I've gotten stronger when I felt the weakest, and that seems paradoxical, but the reality is when you're pushed right back against the wall and losing a partner or losing a friend that's been so integral in your life can feel like the end of the world, but then we find new ways of dealing things and find out that we can do those things. I think also we need to help them make connections. Now here, I think using technology becomes really important. Aid them not to see crisis as insurmountable, but that you'll walk along and be there. That's tough to do these days. And then remind people that change is a part of living. I think the saying has been said many, many times, the only constant in our lives is change. And hopefully we're not losing people every day as we have seen in the past year, but there have been a lot of changes because with every change comes resulting changes and resulting changes. Assist them with making goals and moving toward them. Remind them of what they identify as a sense of meaning, what matters, and their purpose in life. And I think we are permission givers to people like family members and persons who might be going through a hard time with losses and grief, to give them permission for them to do what it takes to help them work through the process. And I think many people will say, after, I wish somebody had told me that earlier. I wish somebody had said, if I'm a carer and I have to say I can no longer care for this person because I can't lift them anymore, for you to say, I'm giving you permission to get help. It's important so that you can be there for them in a different way. And then looking for new opportunities for self-discovery. People have learned in a resilient way that they actually can pay the bills, or many men that I work with have learned to become really good cooks. Some not so good, but that's one thing. Encourage them to nurture a positive view of themselves and help them to keep perspective based on what matters to them. And that's different for every person. And again, in resilience, we need to keep a realistic hopefulness and help them keep a realistic hopefulness and encourage that hopefulness. I'll talk more about hope later. And these came from the American Psychological Association, the last several things I've talked about. So what we need to be about is to looking not only at what the pain and the suffering and all of that is, but how have they coped before? What is their resilience? How do they bounce back? And I love some of these coping things that I've seen, and you can relate to them. For many, it's their faith. Many people who are going through rough times with grief and loss and with dementia tell me that prayer keeps them going, or being able to meditate, or being able to find and have an awareness of small things in their life that give them joy. Humor, so much dark humor in my life I've heard as people have been dying. And some of you probably have as well. And it's not bad, it's not good, it's the way people survive. And problem-solving skills, many, many people have these, but they've forgotten about it in the crisis or in the chronicity of what they're dealing with. And family support. And again, this has been all turned upside down in the age of COVID. True grit, any of you from the Midwest, this is what I grew up with. We can do it. That was the answer. And in some ways that makes caring for them difficult. In other ways, it's an internal resource or an internal strength that can help them. And then what I call just plain old pluck. It's amazing to me, excuse me, how many people maintain this throughout their lives, including their time having dementia. So when we're dealing with those ambiguous losses that are just out there in the environment, we need to help people find meaning, to balance control with acceptance, to broaden identity of the person who is dealing with it and the person who's doing the caring, and manage all of those mixed emotions of fear, anger, guilt, and sadness. To hold on and let go at the same time. That's one of those paradoxical things. I'm holding on to the soul of that person that I love and care about, and I'm letting go of the body or the mind. Help people to imagine new hopes and dreams, and take time to help a person to mind the self. But we need to do that as well. And again, for a really long discussion of that, Pauline Boss's work is most helpful. And she's also written a book about ambiguous loss in the face of dementia, which I found just really, really helpful. And as I work with people over time and share those kind of feelings or issues with them, they always respond. What I think is we miss it too often. We get so boxed into what our chores are or what we need to do that we forget about ourselves in that process. I think there's a really wonderful statement that comes from, it's been attributed to a lot of sources, but I heard it in Robert W. Anderson's book, I Never Sang for My Father, which some of you may know. And he says, death ends a life, but not a relationship. And he goes on to say, which struggles in survivor's mind towards some final resolution, some clear meaning, which perhaps it never finds. And I think that's a reality of life. But so many times I know that the relationships I've had with people who have died, including my mother-in-law and my Aunt Tony, are still there with me now. And I do have thinking about them at the times of birthday and other things, but they were so crucial in developing me as a person that that relationship at some level is still there. So someone tells you, I saw my husband last night, and you know they have dementia, so you're writing it off. Well, maybe they did in a spiritual sense. So be open to that and remembering that when people tell me they've seen someone, they've talked to someone, they appeared at the end of the bed, I don't write those off necessarily as just dementia things that are going on that aren't real. Sometimes they are real. So what are some really simple questions we can ask about dealing with loss and grief with people? I think one of them is, what's important to you right now? And then ask, how can I help you? Maybe what's important to them right now is having a Bible at bedside, even though it may not be a sanitary thing to have there, or the Quran, or whatever else they might read, or whatever else they might need for their spiritual practice. What do people say to you that's important to them right now? Maybe they have the three wishes, or their wishes written out in some way, not three wishes, but the wishes and the kind of evaluation of themselves and their situation, where they can say, I want this, but I don't want this. Not everybody's that well planning, does that well with planning, or has done that well with a plan. But if they haven't, we should reconsider that and be aware of that. A couple of stories. My sister, who is in her 60s, lives alone, has been isolated, and has been widowed and divorced over time. And she had a major crisis in May last year that ended up sending her to the hospital after laying on the floor several days without care. And she's obviously very upset, and she's a person who is a person of faith. And while she was in the ambulance, the EMT wanted to take her blood pressure, but she was doing this. And he said, well, what are you doing? And she said, I'm praying the rosary with my hands. And he said, well, I need to have you stop for a minute, because I need to take your blood pressure. But when I take the cuff off, I'll pray it with you. Well, he intuitively, he was the same religion, and he was able to do that on the way to the hospital, where my sister thought she was checking out for good. She ended up having a pacemaker put in and has heart surgery. But it says to me, it was a very simple thing, but it means so much to my sister, who also deals with MS and a variety of other kinds of issues, that this gentleman would take the time to do that with her and understand that that was important. Another story is about being able to be aware of what rules are in certain cultures about being covered up. And I can't tell you how many times I see people who aren't covered up in long-term care facilities or other places. What does it mean? It means a lot to all of us for privacy, but for some people, it may mean, how are they respected? How are they seen? You work with different groups, you need to know. And if you don't know a particular group, try to find out what you can and let that person be your guide. Now, time is always an issue, and I've said that before, and it's not going to change post-COVID. It just may be different issues to deal with. I think we can look for appropriate referrals to chaplains and spiritual advisors within your hospitals or the places you work, or their particular spiritual advisor. And again, I think if we see carers and support as part of the team and support them to be the helpers, some of that time issue can be lessened as well. And then lead people to support groups. There are bereavement groups. There are people dealing with certain kinds of cancer. There are people dealing with dementia. And all of these now are thinking about technological ways of keeping people together. There's amazing stuff going on. Part of the ASA meeting had to do with how do we connect people even when we can't be together. So I have some closing thoughts about how we deal with loss and grief. And the first I want to talk about this. Excuse me, I seem to be having my allergy problem here. The trees are suspending yellow goo all through the air every day. The idea of journaling for people who are in their last stages. There's a wonderful book that's on your reading list at the end. It's called Lasting Words. It's by a social worker who is also a Buddhist practitioner, and it is a way to help people find meaning toward the close of life. And some of the chapters are things like on gratitude, on hope. Oops, there we go. On wisdom, on prayer, and the last one is on endings. And people read poetry, and they write answers to questions, and then they write for their family or for themselves or for whoever else they want. their answers to those questions. And it's very well illustrated with pictures and with poetry of well-known and not so well-known. And the pictures are just, I don't know if you can see that, probably not. But they're really lovely and they're really beautiful and they're reflective and things for people to think about. Not only for the people you work with, but for yourself. This is an excellent book, I think. And I've used it with groups and I've used it with individuals talking about grief and loss, talking about how they're getting through the end of life, how they're dealing with their life story. People need to tell their life story. We need to be present and listening. But this is a particularly good book that I have found. And, there are questions like, when you think about death, what kind of images, thoughts, and feelings come up for you? Or what parts of dying feel frightening to you? Or what reasonable hopes are you carrying? And they're just prompts. So when people have some time, they can deal with this. And obviously you're not going to have the time to do it, but maybe you will. But to help the family with a book like this, to help someone go through that. And like I say, I've used it with a lot of groups and a lot of people, and people have responded to the questions, the pictures, and the poetry. Then there's the creative arts. I have used a lot of music and poetry and other things to get through to people, visual arts. I'm a music person. I want music played when I die. If I'm around, I want really good classical music. Bach is one of my favorites. But I was aware in one facility in Seattle where they had a cart as people were dying and they played beautiful music. And it was interesting because I thought it was healing and helpful, but a family member who went in said, I don't want to hear that music. I don't want to hear that. He was in his own denial about his mother's death. But as his mother eased out of her life and her time, and she knew she was dying, the music, which was old favorite hymns that she liked, was very, very comforting. To him, it was, oh, it sounds like she's dying. And she was dying. So again, you have to know the person, you have to know the situation, but using creative art, sometimes people do drawings and other things, and it's a really helpful tool. Rituals. We have rituals for people who die and are grieving. We don't have rituals that we can all do at this time. That we have people who can't go to funerals. We have people who can't get their ashes buried. We have people who can only have 2 people with them. I have a friend whose wife died at the end of 2019, had a plan to take them somewhere to be buried in April, had all the things set up at the funeral home in another state where her family grave was, all of this stuff. And then the COVID pandemic came, and he's still sitting with his ashes at her house and doesn't know when they're going to be able to have the ritual. Sometimes we may need to have rituals, small rituals with people ourselves. Again, even a prayer that they might like, or a poem or something. Again, you have to be creative, you have to be open, and you have to help families as a part of the care plan understand about the rituals. When my when my aunt died at 102.5, I was with her, and I did a ritual around the bedside with my aunt who had dementia to help her understand that this sister of hers who'd cared for her all of her life because she was developmentally delayed had died. And I knew that I had to do it at that place at that time because I wasn't sure she was going to get to the funeral. And I think it helped a little bit, but it was just the nurses and the aides and other people, and I stood around with her and helped my other aunt deal with the loss a little bit. And then there's the issue of self-care. We have to remind ourselves and the people that we work with, the people who are dying, the people who are struggling with ill health, their families, their carers, the people around them, that they have to have self-care as well. And this is difficult. We talk about it, but do we do it? And ultimately, as I kind of pull this part together, I think we need to have hope. And what I find is missing in hope is that sometimes people get written off once they get a diagnosis. So I talk about hope. It has a spiritual component. It has a relationship component. We may not be able to meet or get a hold of dealing with all the meaning or the spiritual component, but we do get involved with relationship component as we're helping to do personal care, as we're talking to them, as we're taking vitals, whatever we're doing. And there's a wonderful quote by Václav Havel, who said, hope isn't about believing you can change things, because we're not going to change the chronic illness or the death and dying situation. Hope is about believing that what we do makes a difference. And I think that we need to hear that, and the people that we work with need to hear that, and the carers that are around in that circle around somebody need to hear that as well. I'm going to share a quote from this book about that. And I think it's kind of significant in this time. The very least you can do in your life is to figure out what to hope for. And the most you can do is to live inside of that hope. And that's by Barbara Kingslover. And I like that poem. And the other poem that I've used with caregivers for many, many years is a poem by Denise Levertov. I have a small grain of hope, one small crystal that gleams, clear colors out of transparency. I need more. I break off a fragment to you. Please take this grain of hope so that mine won't shrink. Please share your fragment so that others will grow. Only by division will hope increase. Like a clump of irises, which will cease to flower unless you distribute the clustered roots, unlikely source, clumsy and earth-covered of grace. So Barbara, is it too early to open for questions, or can you do that?
Opened for questions. I have heard from several people who have indicated that they are just really happy to connect with you again. So I thought I'd let you know that Mary Zeitner said she was excited to see that you were speaking. She always found your lectures enjoyable, and she remembered your comments on social worker shoes because she cleaned out a closet today and there were her social worker's shoes. So she said, thanks for the memories. Good. And then Cynthia Garthwaite said that she's a social work educator who has listened to a number of your presentations over the years, and she's appreciated all of your experience and knowledge. So thanks for all you have shared over time. Her question is related to the topic of resilience. You mentioned bouncing back from setbacks. She said she has found that people struggle with that terminology, including me. It sounds like recovering is easier than it really is. Yeah. I think it can be more like climbing back or inching your way back. Any comments on that?
Good point. Yeah, I think that's really well taken. The word that we often use in social work or other fields is resilience, but it is, again, as we deal with different groups, different cultures, different ways of seeing, like, for example, dementia isn't a term that's used in many traditions, many groups. You know, it's not culturally appropriate in several places. So we use a different word. I think the true thing is true about resilience. And I think getting better or seeing the light at the end of the tunnel or whatever seems to fit for that person is often better than a $50 word, we can use a $5 word. Does that make sense?
Yep.
I hope that answers the person's question.
There were also a couple of people who a while back said that they had a similar experience to what you had shared. One person said they were working in an ED and froze up for a minute, I think, seeing someone that they thought maybe was, and I actually had that experience long ago, answered a code in the emergency room, which was unusual because I worked up in coronary care, and they turned the person over and it looked exactly like my dad. So
that's what Bonnie Genevieve is talking about with countertransference, that, it comes on you and you aren't realizing it. But the worst thing that happens is that you don't recognize it and aren't able to get the support or get some other help, because I would have been useless to that man at that point. Or I just have to step back and say, I'm hearing this through the daughter's ears, not through this older person's ears. That's real easy for me to do. And so that's important. Yeah. I think it's common, but we have to name it. We have to learn from it.
And Cynthia's going back to your other discussion about resilience. She said she was suggesting the term bouncing back doesn't sound quite right. Rather than the term resilience, bouncing back sounds automatic or a little too easy.
Okay, that's a good point.
And then another question, how do you support someone through a cold Zoom funeral interview or say goodbye when not able to do so in person?
That is really difficult. I was with a friend who was very, very close to death. Hospice was there. His daughter was far away and his wife was with him. And it's a very poignant time. It was hard for the daughter, but the daughter was able to say, I love you and I care about you and I miss you. All of those things. And the wife needed support through that as well. And I was with her. So, then I could touch her and hug her. And she's one of the people I've only recently been able to go visit again without our masks on. She's a nurse. She knew all this stuff, but when it was her own husband, all the stuff, when we grew up together, basically in terms of our professional careers, all the stuff she knew went right out the window, like it does for all of us. And she was able to be comforted by the people around her, including the carer and the hospice nurse. But the technology worked because we were all there. And then we were able to give support to the daughter as well. But it's cold. It's just difficult. It is. I learned to use Zoom this year so I can connect with my family and other people, but it's hard.
So another comment that this was such an excellent presentation, and the person said, well, I appreciate your points in assimilating into our culture. This has been going on for generations, i.e. my family coming from Ireland in the 1800s. And then the person mentioned the favorite composer, Rachmaninoff, favorite piano piece to play, his prelude in C sharp minor.
I grew up on Bach. And so if you want to make me happy and make me live now, play Bach. If you want to help me die, play Bach.
I actually had a question, if you don't mind my stepping in, because it seems like over the last week or two, I've been talking to people about that. We have some discussions about vaccine hesitancy, and I've puzzled about hesitancy about going back to normal, going back into our offices, our classrooms, our clinics, and having things, start to be normal, and some hesitancy about that. And it occurred to me as I was thinking about your talk, Marty, that that kind of going back to normal also means catching up with people and the losses that they've experienced in the meantime, and how to be open to that without putting pressure on someone who maybe doesn't want to share all that's been going on, and how to respond to people who do share some of the losses that they've been experiencing.
I think that's very, very real. I think as I've gone from being a watcher of people in grocery stores, are you have your mask on or not? And this kind of thing, to thinking now, what will it mean to go back to church, to go back to even my daughter coming was a big thing. She had to be vaccinated. I had to be vaccinated, all this stuff. I think, a really wise older woman said one time, I don't ask people how they are. I ask them what's on their heart. And that feeling of how we're open to people to hear, and not to immediately jump in and say, oh, I know what you mean, I've been there too, but to say, well, what's that been like for you? And how has it affected how you are today, where you are? I think, and then repeat back to them as they tell you, well, luckily the person I lost to COVID was somebody who actually, his wife was a better friend of mine, and I hadn't seen him for a while. It was the beginning of COVID. It was in a Seattle nursing home that was, had all the COVID at the beginning. I think some people are worried about how much they can share. And if they understand that you are an open heart and open listener, they might be more willing to share. But I would kind of reflect it back. But I thought the woman had the right thing to say instead of saying, how are you? What's in your heart? I think that gets at more the kind of loss and grief people are feeling. The people who've helped me online, it's been tough, keep saying to me, you are where you need to be right now. When I say I feel down, I sit and look out at the birds instead of doing housework or doing anything. And he said, you are where you need to be right now. And I think that will be true for people as we come back.
And what about the reconnecting now that skilled care facilities are opening up and things like that, with relatives and friends?
My sister-in-law lives in assisted living in Spokane. She saw her son live for the first time last week. She is convinced in her dementia that she never had COVID. It never was at the facility, even though 20 people died. And that was staff and residents. And she's convinced now that she's going to pack up and leave. And that's not, it's not necessarily been the best thing for my nephew to try to have to deal with her. So even though he wants to be back and she wants him back, it's also reminding her, oh, I'm in this place and, and I need to leave, and I packed up and I'm ready to come home with you now. And what was all this stuff going on anyway? You can't get it. So for those people, it's going to be good and bad. I think it's going to be different. The routine is different. The normal rituals of life are going to be different. It's just, I don't know, Barbara. It's a good question.
I guess we'll find out.
Well, the one thing I'm aware of is most of the people, we're a very low percentage number of people with COVID, but we've just had a recent uptick. But people wear their masks, they do the distancing, they're taking care of themselves. But I have friends who won't be vaccinated for lots of different reasons. And I feel like, do I have the right to say to them, have you got your vaccines yet? Or, and so I feel socially a little uncomfortable about, so where do we start off now? And do we give each other a hug, or, all those things? And with loss and grief, touch is so important. And we haven't been able to touch people, except all of you who work in the hospital or other healthcare facilities who are doing daily touch and how, with whatever, turning a body, giving a bath, whatever. But how do you incorporate real touch that's real touch, but it's not caring touch in the same way. So how do we incorporate that? I think that's a big question.
Well, I think we're at the end of our time, and I don't see other questions other than lots of comments to thank you, and I'll send those along your way, Marty. It's just been so great to have you talk with us today. Really, really appreciate it. And thank you for catching me up a couple of days ago. It was wonderful to do our speaker test.
Yeah, it
Yeah.
has been, as I told Barbara, I have been involved with the NWGEC and the NWGWEC since their inceptions. And so that's over 20 years. And it's always good to be with you all. I wish I were in some of your places like Alaska. And I saw one name come up as one of my former students. Good to see you again. And know you're out there. And so I hope that you're all doing well and you take care and you do the self-care you need to do to keep on keeping on. Thank you, Barbara.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And I'll see all of you again next Tuesday.
Good.
Bye-bye.